name's Ellie Tiemans, and this is a passage analysis of Chapter 7 of Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. For 3 years, Ike Mifuna lived in Okonkwo's household, and the elders of Umuofia seemed to have forgotten about him. He grew rapidly like a yam tendril in the rainy season, and was full of the sap of life. He had become wholly absorbed into his new family. He was like an elder brother to Noe, and from the very first seemed to have kindled a new fire in the younger boy. He made him feel grown up, and they no longer spent the evenings in his mother's hut while she cooked, but now sat with Okonkwo on his obi, or watched him as he tapped his palm tree for the evening wine. Nothing pleased Noe more than to be sent forth by his mother or another of his father's wives, to do one of those difficult and masculine tasks in the home, like splitting wood or pounding food. On receiving such a message through a younger brother or sister, Noe would feign annoyance and grumble aloud about women and their troubles. Okonkwo was inwardly pleased at his son's development, and he knew it was due to Ike Mifuna. He wanted Noe to grow into a tough young man, capable of ruling his father's household when he was dead and gone, to join the ancestors. He wanted him to be a prosperous man, having enough in his barn to feed the ancestors with regular sacrifices. And so he was always happy when he heard him grumbling about women. That showed that in time he would be able to control his womenfolk. No matter how prosperous a man was, if he was unable to rule his women and his children, and especially his women, he was not really a man. He was like the man in the song who had 10 and 1 wives and not enough soup for his fufu. So Okonkwo encouraged the boys to sit with him in his obi, and he told them stories of the land. Masculine stories of violence and bloodshed. Noe knew that it was right to be masculine, to be violent, but somehow he still preferred the stories that his mother used to tell, and which she no doubt still told to her younger children. Stories of the tortoise and his wily ways, and of the bird, Aniki Niti Oba, who challenged the whole world to a wrestling contest, and was finally thrown by a cat. He remembered the story she often told of the quarrel between earth and sky long ago, and how sky withheld rain for 7 years, until crops withdrew and the dead could not be buried because the hose broke on the stony earth. At last Vulture was sent to plead with Sky, and to soften his heart with a song of the suffering of the sons of the men. Whenever Noe's mother sang this song, he felt carried away to the distant scene in the sky where Vulture, Earth's emissary, sang for mercy. At last Sky was moved to pity, and he gave to Vulture rain wrapped in leaves of cocoa yam. But as he flew home, his long talon pierced the leaves, and the rain fell as it had never fallen before. And so heavily did it rain on Vulture that he did not return to deliver his message, but flew to a distant land, from where he had espied a fire. And when he got there, he found it was a man making a sacrifice. He warmed himself in the fire and ate the entrails. That was the kind of story that Noe loved. But he now knew that they were for foolish women and children, and he knew that his father wanted him to be a man. And so he feigned that he no longer cared for women's stories. And when he did this, he saw that his father was pleased, and no longer rebuked him or beat him. So Noe and Ike Mifuna would listen to Okonkwo's stories about tribal wars, or how, years ago, he had stalked his victim, overpowered him, and obtained his first human head. And as he told them of the past, they sat in darkness or the dim glow of logs, waiting for the women to finish their cooking. When they finished, each brought her bowl of fufu and bowl of soup to her husband, and an oil lamp was lit, and Okonkwo tasted from each bowl, and then passed 2 shares to Noe and Ike Mifuna. And then quite suddenly a shadow fell on the world, and the sun seemed hidden behind a thick cloud. Okonkwo looked up from his work and wondered if it was going to rain at such an unlikely time of the year. But almost immediately a shout of joy broke out in all directions, and Umuofia, which had dozed in the noonday haze, broke out into life and activity. Locusts are descending, was joyfully chanted everywhere, and men, women, and children left their work or their play and ran into the open to see the unfamiliar sight. The locusts had not come for many, many years, and only the old people had seen them before. At first a fairly small swarm came. They were the harbingers sent to survey the land. And then appeared on the horizon a slowly moving mass like a boundless sheet of black cloud drifting towards Umuofia. Soon it covered half the sky, and the solid mass was now broken by tiny eyes of light like shining stardust. It was a tremendous sight, full of power and beauty. And here is my interpretation of the passage. On this first slide, we see that he grew rapidly like a yam tendril in the rainy season and was full of the sap of life, is used to describe Ike Mifuna. This is a simile, which means that he was not only growing physically, but by comparing Ike Mifuna to a yam, a symbol of masculinity, it also shows that he was growing into a man, which helped him earn the respect of his father, Okonkwo. also see that it says that he seemed to have kindled a new fire in the younger boy. The fire is used as a symbol throughout this book for life and masculinity, but it also means that Ike Mifuma has a new desire in him. Achebe creates an overall mood of optimism in this passage, showing that Ike Mifuma is adjusting to his new life and growing. The syntax in this passage is simple language with repetition, as he uses the word he to start many sentences. In this next slide, we see that Achebe uses the theme of masculinity again to show that these tasks, such as splitting wood or pounding food, are men's work. We also see contrast between Okonkwo and Nwori, as Nwori has to feign, which means fake, annoyance, and grumble because he knows that it'll please his father to complain about the women. We also see a neutral and objective tone created by Achebe, and the diction here is created. The diction is created using simple language, narrative style, and native Igbo words such as obi to create that native cadence of the Igbo people. In this next part, we see that Okonkwo was inwardly pleased at his son's development. This is a contrast because it shows that Okonkwo doesn't show emotion outwardly, but he does show it inwardly because showing emotion outwardly is not as manly and strong. We also see repetition of the words join the ancestors and talks about the ancestors. It also shows the theme throughout the whole book of respect for the ancestors and belief in the God. In this next part, we see that Okonkwo says that he is always happy when he heard him grumbling about women. This shows a paradox because parents aren't usually pleased at their children's discontent and grumbling, and it also shows the difference in the Igbo culture than from the European culture. We also see paradox in where it says, no matter how prosperous a man was, if he was unable to rule his women and his children, he was not really a man. This is paradox because in culture that we think of, ruling women isn't really associated with prosperity of a man. Then we also see allegory and simile, as he says, he was like the man in the song who had 10 and 1 wives and not enough soup for his fufu, which is comparing Okonkwo to this parable in the song of the man who had 11 wives and not enough soup. On this next, we see that Okonkwo is juxtaposed to Nwori because Okonkwo loves to tell stories of masculinity and violence and bloodshed, but Nwori says that he knows that it's right to be masculine, to be violent, but he prefers these other stories that his mother tells, which are, in culture, are associated with femininity. Nwori prefers these stories because they have lessons and morals, and they talk about nature rather than this senseless violence and bloodshed. We also see a little bit of alliteration with wily ways, talking about the tortoise. We also see the beginning of another allegory, talking about this bird, Aniki Nitioba, and who challenges a cat to a wrestling match. On this next slide, we see more allegory, as it talks about the quarrel between earth and sky, and this story helps to explain human life. It also has vivid imagery, as it talks about the vulture pleading with the sky to soften his heart. On this next slide, we have more allegory, as it continues the story of the vulture. We learn that this story not only helps explain things in their culture, such as weather, but it also teaches forgiveness and gratitude. We also see personification of the vulture and the sky, as they're not actually human objects, but they're talked about as sending messages and talking to each other, which are human characteristics. And then once again, we see symbolism of fire, and that's talking again about the vulture and masculinity. On this next slide, we see some diction as Achebe uses multiple sentences in a row that start with conjunctions, which creates more of a staccato diction. We also see parallel structure as he starts these sentences in the same way. And we learn a little bit more about the Igbo culture as Noi learns that stories are foolish and for women. And we also learn that Okonkwo talks about his stories about obtaining his first human head. And then we also see some contrast between Okonkwo again and Nwai, because Nwai wants to learn these so-called foolish stories, but Okonkwo is just talking about his victims and the tribal wars, which Nwai really wants no part of. In this next part, we see vivid imagery again with the dim glow of logs, and then we learn more about the theme of gender roles in their culture as the women make the soup and bring it to their husbands, and as the husbands sit around with their children and teach them about the manly stories of the war. We also have this symbol of eating food together, which shows communion and shows that Okonkwo is starting to accept his son Nwai, and Nwai is starting to earn the respect of Okonkwo. If we skip ahead a bit in the chapter, we see that this shadow comes over the world and everybody breaks out in joy. This is a paradox. An invasion of locusts isn't really associated with joy. And then when it talks about the locusts are descending and joyfully chanted, again we see that paradox. We also see this allusion to the Bible, as one of the plagues was the locust coming. But there's contradiction because in the Bible the locusts eat all the crops, but here the people are rejoicing, even though their livelihood is their crops of yam. And then we also see the personification of the locusts as they are described as the harbingers sent to survey the land. And there's also simile as the locusts are described a slow-moving mass like a boundless sheet of black cloud drifting towards Umuofia. And then the description here, such as tiny eyes of light shining like stardust, creates more imagery. We also see foreshadowing in this passage of the locusts coming, to foreshadowing of the white missionaries coming later in the book. But there's contradiction because they are joyful of the locusts, but the missionaries are a threat to them. And that is the end of my passage analysis of Chapter 7 of Things Fall Apart.